See what the blue in my guy's line. I was on a call or something. Oh, it was very.
Okay.
Is it a marker? And they're like, who started this? And the guy was like, yeah, you're gonna have to like.
So
Somewhere else because I don't want to see your face.
the past semester we spoke about spiritual combat and we spoke about the three great enemies of the soul. Do you remember, Zach? What are the three great enemies of the soul?
The world,
The world,
the flesh,
the flesh,
and the devil.
the devil. Good job. And and we also spoke about the three main ways in which we grow spiritually, in which we engage in this spiritual combat, and those were prayer, sacraments. We spoke about the Eucharist and confession, and then we also spoke about good deeds, right? About the importance of doing good deeds with intense love. So now we're going to move laterally, and let's say the great title of the talks that we will share this semester or this spring are, they're called the auxiliary means of spiritual growth. So the primary means of spiritual growth are prayer, sacraments, and good deeds. Now we're going to look at the auxiliary means of spiritual growth, right? And today we're going to speak about something very, 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 very important, and I think this talk can really get us closer to God in this coming week. And we're going to talk about the exercise of the presence of God, right? The exercise of the presence of God. And I think we all kind of have an idea or a general grasp of what this means, but we're going to delve more in detail, because I think this is a spiritual practice that can really profit our day-to-day life, can really bring us closer to Jesus, bring us closer to the Lord. I think that in a way, living in the presence of God is like a complementary practice to the practice of prayer, right? So one thing is daily prayer, and living in the presence of God is something that complements very well the idea of prayer. So let's think first about the definition. What is the presence of God? Okay. So this is basically the definition. To live the presence of God is to consider as frequently as you can the fact that God is all the time looking at us, that God is inside of us, and that this should lead us to lead our lives, to conduct ourselves permanently in His presence. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this definition. The presence of God is the frequent consideration of the essential truth that God is always around us, inside of us, and that this should lead us into living a life like conducting ourselves in His presence. This seems obvious, but I think it's crucial. So I think this definition begs the question, how often do we consider in our day that God is first around us, but perhaps more importantly is inside of us? How often do we consider this truth? And I'm asking you this question because I'm the first one convicted by this question. It is true, like I pray. I spend my time before the Blessed Sacrament every day. But I'm still convicted by the question because I frequently I'm amazed of how disconnected I can be from my morning prayer to my evening prayer from the Lord. But the presence of God is the permanent consideration of His presence outside of us and inside of us. That we should conduct ourselves permanently with this in mind. So, definition is to consider as frequently as possible I'm not going to write it down. Consider it as frequently as possible, how He is around us and inside of us, and how this should lead us to conduct our lives in His presence permanently. Second point. What is the sanctifying power of this practice? What is the sanctifying power of this practice? Why is this practice relevant? Why is this practice important? And the basic reason is this practice is important because if we consider permanently His presence, this would mean that we would conduct ourselves in our life living in a recollect manner. Living, let's say, what is the antonym of recollect? Dispersed? Dispersed? Instead of living dispersed, this means that we would live recollect. That we would live in such a way that our mind and our actions are permanently in harmony with His will. So the sanctifying power of this practice is that we would lead a more recollect life. A second consideration is if we really engage in this presence of God, this would lead us to a position of permanent prayer. And I think this is very important. And let's use this image, right? So sometimes, let's say in my own life, right? I have my morning prayer, 1 hour, my evening prayer, right? 1 hour too. So the presence of God, what does it generate? It generates or should generate or lead us to a place of permanent prayer, right? So, I don't know, I want to offer you a question or an example. When we are commuting to our jobs, like when we're driving to the places where we work, how often do we pray? How often do we lift up our hearts? How often do we, I don't know, offer an act of love to the Lord, right? When we sit down in our computer, when we're going through the emails or through the spreadsheets, right? How often does our life look like a continual prayer? Or is it really just like precise moments in the day that perhaps are not very long at all? So what I'm saying is, the sanctifying power of living in the presence of God is turning our life into a permanent form of prayer. Obviously, not with the same intensity as the moments that you dedicate exclusively to prayer, but in a way, what it will look like is that our prayer stretches itself out during the day, right? Stretches itself out during the day. When we think about the sanctifying power of the presence of God, St. Francis de Sales, he went as far as saying that he thought that if you really practice the presence of God, you didn't need the other spiritual practices. Like the rosary was not needed, prayer was not needed, spiritual reading was not needed, because everything could be contained in the presence of God. Like if you conducted yourself in the presence, if you really consider permanently the presence of God during the day, you wouldn't need all of the other spiritual practices. He said this would be enough for us to be in a permanent place of prayer and holiness. In fact, he says not only that this practice can substitute all of the other practices, but he says that all of the other practices can substitute this practice. If you don't have the presence of God, the other practices they don't have the real power, right? So the presence of God, in the opinion of St. Francis de Sales, is basic, it's essential to our process of holiness. Okay, so we've talked about the definition, we talked about the sanctifying importance of this exercise. We've said that it would help us to lead a life of recollection. It would make our prayer permanent. We've talked about St. Francis de Sales. Now let's talk about the theological, what's the theological I'm sorry, the word escapes me. Foundation of this practice, right? So you have the practice, and what's the theological foundation? So we know that there is an attribute of God called immensity of God, right? So there are 5 ways in which we can talk about God's presence, right? 5 ways. So first way is the presence of immensity. What does this mean? God is everywhere. God is everywhere. And St. Thomas of Aquinas, he explains that God is everywhere in 3 different ways. He says God is everywhere in essence. What does this mean? That everything that exists, it exists because, let's say, God is maintaining that thing in existence. Right? Everything that exists because of God. And God is present in every single thing. Did you know that God is present in the demons? And God is present in a soul that is in mortal sin. God is present everywhere. We know that He's here right now. Not only is He here right now, He's in everything that exists. So His presence of immensity is of essence. En español es presencia de potencia. ¿Cómo se dice eso en inglés?
But is this the power one?
Power, yeah. Okay? So God has created everything through His Word, and God maintains by His power everything in existence, and also by presence. What does that mean? Everything is seen by God, and nothing can hide from God. So, like, the first way, yeah.
When you say God is in everything, does that include like this water bottle?
Everything. God is in everything.
Not in a pantheist.
I mean, yeah, it's not that God is that thing. I'm not saying that God is that thing.
Yeah.
Right? I'm
But
not saying
it's
that.
in inanimate objects, not just in like
Yeah.
human beings.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, He's in everything. He's maintaining everything in existence. And as He maintains everything in existence, because He maintains it, in a certain way, He's present in everything. Because if He was absent, that thing could not exist. Right? If He was absent, things wouldn't exist. His presence is in everything in such a way that He maintains things in existence. So think about this, Greg. Sometimes when we think about creation, we think like, oh, God, many years ago, God created things and things exist because God created things. But Aquinas helps us to understand that God's creation is not something that happened in the past. God's creation is permanent. Creation is a permanent act, right? So in a sense, God is in everything because God is maintaining everything in existence. Okay? Second form of presence of God is by habitation. What does this mean? That every single soul that has sanctifying grace, so every single baptized person who is living in sanctifying grace, we have the certainty that God lives in that soul in a special manner. Right? So, we've said God exists in everything, God exists in every single person, but in those who have sanctifying grace in themselves, God has a special way of being in them, and it is a presence of friendship that brings us to divine life. Okay? So the second presence of God is the presence of habitation. And this means He lives in every single soul that is in sanctifying grace. Okay? So right now, if we are in sanctifying grace, we have the certainty that God is not only in us because of His presence of immensity, but He also habitates us in a special way through charity. Okay? Third manner is His presence in the Eucharist. Fourth manner is His presence in Jesus Christ with his hypostatic union, así se dice, unión hipostática. And the fifth way is he has a presence of manifestation for those who are in heaven. In heaven, God's presence is manifested to those who have, reached salvation, the fullness of salvation. So these are the 5 ways in which God is present in the world, right? But the 2 ways that are relevant to the presence of God as a spiritual practice are these 2. The presence of immensity and the presence of habitation. Now, let's look at the practical consequences of how this should affect our life. Okay? What are the practical consequences? And the first one is powerful. Like, if we would really practice the presence of God, this would mean that it would be very hard for us to sin. Let me put it this way. Imagine that we are in the army and you have your when you go to boot camp, what's the name of the person who trains you?
Drill sergeant.
Your drill sergeant? Okay, let's think about boot camp. Let's think about a soldier who's just getting trained. If you were in the presence of your drill sergeant, would you do something stupid? Would you do something unworthy? No, because the presence of an authority really moves you to do things in the right way, right? The higher the authority, the more you feel convicted to make the right decisions, right? So the first consequence, the first practical consequence of living in the presence of God is we would be much more inclined to avoid sin and to avoid venial sins and defects. Because the more you would consider that God is looking at you, that God is there with you, the more you would think twice before doing something stupid, right? Yeah, like let's think this through just for a second. How different would our decisions be on our day-to-day life if we felt convicted that God is looking at us in that moment? That nothing escapes his gaze. So the first consequence is we would flee from sin because we would find it unworthy to do something sinful in his presence. And that is why I remember when I was a kid, I went to confession and the priest said, "Would you just confess? Would you do that before your parents?" And I said, "No." And he asked me, "Then why do you do it before God?" How can you do that if God is looking at you? And this is something we forget, right? This is something we forget. So the first consequence is living in the presence of God would really convict us to flee from sin because we know he is with us in that moment. Not only looking at us, but dwelling in us if we're in sanctifying grace. So that's the first immediate consequence that we can draw from this idea, right? Where did I put chalk? So I would say the first consequence is we would be convicted to flee from sin. Second, we would be moved to do things with greater perfection. We would be moved to do things in a better way. So think about this. Would you work in the same way if you worked in the presence of God? Perhaps wouldn't we slack a little bit less if we embraced His presence during our day? Would we really conduct ourselves in our duties and responsibilities in the same way if we knew He was looking at us? Wouldn't this lead us to make things with more perfection, with more love, doing things more thoroughly through? So the second consequence is living in the presence of God really leads you to act with more perfection in your day-to-day tasks, to do things better. A third practical consequence could be that we would act with more. This is what the book says. Perhaps this is a concept that is a little bit foreign to us, but I'm still going to share with you. He said, this would make us act with more modesty, knowing that we're always in His presence, even when we are by ourselves. So the author, he brought an example from the life of St. Francis de Sales, and he said that this is kind of an interesting anecdote, but he said that one of the priests that lived with St. Francis of Sales, he made like a hole in the door to look at St. Francis of Sales' dormitory to see how he conducted himself when there was no one around. And this is a little bit from the time of St. Francis de Sales, but apparently on those days it was immodest to cross your legs when you were sitting down, or to put. No, I mean, it's interesting. I'm not. But even in the life of Father Menor, like part of the rules of the Jesuits was that when they were sitting down, they were supposed not to cross their legs. Like it was. That's why I said maybe this is not too relevant for us because this is not part of our culture anymore. But the idea is, if you live in the presence of God, you conduct yourself with modesty wherever you are, because you know He's looking at you all the time.
People who always look into the cells.
Yeah, I was like, is that where are you going? Where are you going with that?
And a fourth consequence would be that we would feel strengthened in our spiritual combat. Let me put it this way. Let me offer you this example. Maybe when we were kids and we were playing a sport, soccer in my case, right? If your dad went to see you play soccer, you would kind of put a little bit more effort, right? You would really want to show off. You would want to do a good job because you know your dad is looking at you. So in the same way, if we lived more in the presence of God, we would be more convicted in our spiritual combat. In the same way that a kid would be motivated by the presence of his father looking at him in sports, we could also be more convicted in finding special and extra strength in our spiritual combat. Makes sense, right? Okay. Last point. How are we to practice this presence of God? How can we bring it to practical terms to our day-to-day life? So there are basically two ways. And the first way is external representation of God, right? With your imagination, externally seeing the presence of God and that He is seeing you, right? Maybe we will have a crucifix that really moves us. So imagining the Christ in the crucifix with us all the time could be a manner of external representation to live the presence of God during our day. But the other example is the internal representation, or the fact that we also have to embrace that God dwells in us. So we don't need an external representation. What we need is an internal representation, and embracing the fact that God dwells in you. And that the whole Trinity dwells in you. There's a very incredible Carmelite nun. Maybe you've heard of her. Her name is Isabel of the Trinity. Have you heard of her? So Isabel of the Trinity, she was a Carmelite nun. She lived in the 19th century. She was French. And all of her, I think she's a doctor of the church, maybe. I'm not sure. But all of her writings center around the fact that she is the host of the Holy Trinity. And that the Holy Trinity dwells in her. And that she's like, I don't want to go outside of my soul, because I have in my own soul the whole Trinity. So that's why I'm saying, first way to practice this is external representation. Second way to practice it is internal representation. Both methods are okay. Whatever works for us best, that's what we have to choose. We have to choose whatever leads us to a place of permanent prayer, to a place of fulfilling our duties better and better. So is it possible to live the presence of God uninterruptedly? For us, it's impossible. For us that we are just beginners in the spiritual life, it's impossible. For the saints who got to the mystical levels, this is something they could attain in a way. And they said this was, in a sense, an anticipation of heaven. The fact that you are always in the presence of God in the way that we're going to be in heaven. Right? So let's do a synthesis. We first talked about the definition, and the definition is the continual consideration of God's presence outside of us or inside of us, the continual consideration, intellectual consideration of His presence outside or inside of us, that should lead us to live in His presence, to conduct ourselves in His presence. Second, we spoke about how does this profit us spiritually? And I said, number one, it helps us to live more recollect. Number two, it leads us to a place of permanent prayer. We talked about how St. Francis de Sales said that this spiritual practice could substitute all of the other spiritual practices. Everything could be synthesized in this. But at the same time, and he said also, all of the other things cannot substitute this. We spoke about how this has a theological foundation. God's presence in everything, immensity, habitation in the soul that is in sanctifying grace, in the Eucharist, in Jesus Christ, and for those who are in heaven. Then we spoke about the practical consequences. If we lived in the presence of God, we would flee from sin in the same way that a soldier would never do something unworthy in front of his drill master because the drill master is looking at him. In the same way, we would flee from sin. We would be convicted to do things with more perfection. We would also be more modest everywhere we go. We would also have a special strength for a spiritual fight in the same way that when your dad came to see you or came to see us for sports, we would, put something extra in. And lastly, we can either practice this with an external representation, or it could also be an internal representation. I look at my own life and I say, how much I would profit is if I could bring this to my day-to-day. I mean, this would be beautiful. This would be beautiful. Let's think about just the consequences. Fleeing from sin. Doing things with more perfection. Let's try to bring this to our day-to-day life. Okay?
Father,
Yes.
that fifth